The words dropped like a hammer. Your 12 years here are over. Victor Lang didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stood at the edge of his glossy desk, arms folded, the Manhattan skyline stretched wide behind him like a trophy he thought he owned. The Hudson shimmered in late afternoon light, a cruel reminder that the city moved forward, indifferent to whether I stayed or vanished. I kept my expression even. 12 years of contracts negotiated through storms, mergers, bankruptcies, narrowly avoided reduced to a single sentence. My file was already printed, waiting on the polished wood surface. One page, one line for my name, one box for my signature. He slid a pen toward me. Sign it, and security will escort you out. My hand moved automatically, muscle memory from years of initialing clause after clause. But as I lowered the pen, my eyes caught the fine print in the termination protocol. My name, embedded in the authorization chain. Calloway. M. Primary signatory. I blinked once, twice, but it didn't change. The company's contract system still bore my digital signature, the encrypted key that bound every agreement. I signed the termination notice with deliberate care, almost amused by the irony. Victor thought he was cutting me loose, but in reality, he just severed the company from its own bloodstream. Every vendor contract, every acquisition deal, every renewal, the ink didn't move unless my signature unlocked it. And that wasn't written on any form he understood. Leave your badge at HR, he said, already reaching for his phone, already moving on. I slid the document back across the desk, meeting his eyes long enough to let him believe he'd won. Then I gathered my coat, my old leather bag, and stepped toward the door. In the hallway, the hum of elevators echoed against the marble. I kept walking, past assistants whispering in corners, past the framed photographs of ribbon cuttings and stock market bells. They didn't look at me, and I didn't offer them anything to look at. Outwardly, I was finished, but inside, the thought pressed firm and steady they had no idea what they'd just done. By the time I reached the ground floor, the sting of humiliation had cooled into something sharper, something quieter. I wasn't gone. Not yet. And as I pushed through the revolving doors onto the street, carrying nothing more than my worn bag and an empty sense of finality, I knew the silence I left behind would speak louder than anything I could say. The elevator ride down felt longer than 12 years. Each floor dinged like a verdict, echoing in the hollow space where my career used to live. I clutched the leather strap of my bag, the weight inside almost laughably light, my Bite Me mug, a wireless mouse I'd bought with my own money, and an origami crane a summer intern once folded for me during a brutal quarter. That was it. A decade and more of service, packed into cardboard and silence. As the doors slid open on the 22nd floor, I caught a glimpse of familiar faces, people I'd trained, mentored, defended in negotiations. They turned away quickly, suddenly fascinated by their monitors, their shoes, their paper clips. No one wanted to be caught meeting my eyes. To acknowledge me was to risk catching the same diseased disposability. I kept moving, past glass cubicles where I'd spent late nights writing clauses no one ever thanked me for, past the break room where I'd once missed my daughter's 9th birthday party because a client was threatening to pull a deal. Nina's cake had sat half-melted on the counter by the time I got home that night, her smile forced and tired from waiting. The memory followed me like a shadow now, reminding me of every time I'd chosen the company over her. Was my silence all these years loyalty or fear? Did I believe that being indispensable meant I'd be safe, or was I simply afraid of what would happen if I ever demanded more? The lobby swallowed me in its cold marble and artificial calm. The receptionist barely lifted her head, as if I had already been erased from the building's memory. I nodded anyway, a courtesy to no one in particular, and pushed through the revolving doors. Outside, the city roared with the same indifference I'd seen from Victor's office window. Traffic snarled, horns blared, and a street vendor shouted about hot pretzels. Life didn't pause just because I was no longer part of their machine. But somewhere high above, in the floors I'd just left behind, silence was already starting to tighten its grip. My apartment in Brooklyn had never felt so small. The peeling paint, the radiator hissing in the corner, the faint hum of traffic outside it was all a stark contrast to the steel and glass tower I'd just walked out of. I set the box on my kitchen counter, pulled out the laptop I'd kept more out of habit than hope, and logged into my personal backup. Rows of files blinked awake, each one a reminder of the years I'd given away. Contracts archived by quarter. Supplier renewals, merger agreements, all neatly stored. I clicked into the authentication log, my fingers moving automatically, as if I were still on the clock. And there it was. Every single agreement listed the same line in bold, Authorized Signatory Calloway. My digital signature, encrypted and locked with the biometric key I'd registered years ago, stood like a gatekeeper across the company's empire. Without it, nothing moved. No supplier got paid. No merger went through. No licensing deal reached a courtroom. They could fire me, but they couldn't fire the code that held my name. I leaned back, the old chair creaking beneath me, and let the memory unfold. 1. A lawsuit had nearly gutted the company after a junior manager slipped an unauthorized clause into a supplier deal. The settlement was ugly, and the board demanded a fail-safe one signature, one custodian, someone they could trust. I had been the obvious choice, quiet, meticulous, incorruptible, or so they thought. They wanted security, so they bound everything to me. At the time, it felt like responsibility. Now, it felt like leverage. I closed the laptop, tracing the faint scratches across its lid with my fingertip. They thought they'd ended me with a single line on a termination form. But upstairs, in that glass tower, the countdown had already started. By morning, they would find themselves locked out of their own future. By the time the sun cut through the blinds of my kitchen, the storm had already begun. I didn't need access to their inboxes to know it. Panic travels faster than any memo. A friend still buried in legal texted before 8. 3 deals frozen. System won't push through. Do you know why I didn't answer? At headquarters. Conference rooms filled before the first pot of coffee finished brewing. Legal pulled up the contracts, expecting a clerical hiccup, maybe a missing clause. Instead, every page glared back the same truth. Authorized Signatory Maren Calloway. It was summoned. Voices rising through the hallways, but their report only sharpened the panic. No overrides, no alternate credentials. The system wasn't broken, it was doing exactly what it had been built to do. I sat in a cafe 2 blocks from my apartment, hands wrapped around a warm mug, the smell of roasted beans cutting through the city's usual noise. My phone buzzed on the counter, again and again. LinkedIn pings. Old colleagues suddenly remembering I existed. Hope you're well. Quick question. Are you free to chat messages layered on top of each other until the notifications blurred? I let them pile up. I watched a couple argue gently over a crossword, an old man feed crumbs to pigeons outside, and thought about how the board must look right now, suits leaning over laptops, CFO sweating through his tie, Victor insisting it was just a glitch. The calm around me felt almost staged, as if the world itself wanted to highlight their unraveling. The first crack had opened, small and jagged, but deep enough to show what lay beneath. And as the morning wore on, I knew that silence in their boardroom would grow heavier, sharper, until it forced someone to speak my name out loud. By the end of the day, I wouldn't be the ghost they escorted out. I'd be the name written across every wall they couldn't unlock. By mid-morning, the fire had reached the top floor. The board gathered around the long mahogany table on the 40th story, the skyline behind them gleaming like it was mocking their urgency. Victor stood at the head, clicking through a recycled deck of slides I'd seen a dozen times before. He talked about growth, about synergy opportunities, his voice confident, rehearsed. For a moment, he almost looked like he believed himself. Then the screen went black. A second later, red text filled the projector in a font no one could ignore. Access restricted. Authorized Signatory Maren Calloway. The silence that followed was different from the usual boardroom hush. It was sharp, jagged, cutting through Victor's performance like glass shattering on marble. Franklin, one of the older directors, leaned forward. Who the hell authorized this Clive Danner, the CFO who had strutted around ever since Victor brought him in, adjusted his collar with trembling fingers? It's a legacy system, he muttered. Old permissions that never got updated. We'll sort it out. Sort it out, another director snapped. We have 3 pending acquisitions. Do you plan on sorting those out with your imagination? Clive's face flushed red. He reached for his laptop, tapped furiously, but the screen showed the same message. My name, glowing in bold, unmovable letters. I imagined the scene as I sat in my cafe corner, sipping the last of my coffee while their tower of glass and ego quaked from the inside. My name wasn't supposed to be spoken in that room. For 12 years, they'd skimmed over it, signed above it, never pausing to notice who actually held their empire together. Now it was the only word any of them could see. The board turned back to Victor, their expressions heavy with expectation. His jaw tightened, his smile gone. He knew what they all knew. The problem wasn't a system glitch. The problem was me, and by nightfall, someone in that room would have no choice but to pick up the phone. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the radiator and the faint noise of traffic drifting up from the street. I had settled into the corner of my couch, glass of wine in hand, when my phone began to vibrate across the coffee table. The screen showed nothing but blocked caller. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before finally answering. There was a pause on the other end. Then Victor's voice, stripped of its usual arrogance, low and worn. Every deal needs your name. Explain. I leaned back against the cushion, letting his words hang in the air. How quickly confidence rots when the numbers stop moving. I didn't rush my reply. That depends, I said softly. Do you want a patch or a permanent solution? The silence stretched, filled with the faint crackle of his breath through the line. He wasn't used to asking, only commanding. And now, his empire was stuck on 2 words he couldn't erase my name. We just need access restored, he said finally. Get us through this quarter. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the reflection of the lamp ripple across its surface. Temporary fixes don't interest me. If you want your contracts breathing again, you'll need to consider something permanent. Another pause. I could almost hear him calculating, balancing pride against necessity, weighing whether he could bluff his way another day. He couldn't. What do you want? He asked at last, the words tasting bitter, even from a distance. I smiled to myself, not because it was funny, but because the question had finally been asked out loud. For 12 years, I had given them everything without asking for more. Now the balance had shifted, and he knew it. I set the glass down and spoke evenly, my voice steady as if I had rehearsed it 1,000 times. Tomorrow morning, I'll tell you the terms. I barely slept, not from nerves, but from clarity, for the first time in years. I wasn't wondering how to please them. I was deciding how they would have to please me. By dawn, the city outside my window was already awake, headlights streaking over the Brooklyn Bridge like veins pulsing with purpose. I picked up the phone before Victor had the chance to call again. "You'll have my terms now," I said once he answered. My voice didn't waver. There was a breath on the other end, clipped and tense. "Go on." "First," I began, "I want full reinstatement, not as a manager buried 3 layers down, executive status, with authority reflected in title and access." I could almost hear his jaw tighten, but he didn't interrupt. "Second," I continued, "I report directly to you. No CFO in my chain of command, no filters, no interference." Another pause. This one longer. He exhaled slowly, a sound that told me he was replaying Clive's fumbling excuses in the boardroom. "And third," I said, letting the weight of it settle, "my compensation changes. No flat salary boxed in by HR spreadsheets. A performance-based clause that reflects the revenue these contracts generate. If the company wins, I win. No less." Silence stretched across the line. The Victor I'd known a day ago would have laughed, dismissed me as replaceable. But that Victor no longer had leverage. This one, cornered by his own decision, simply asked, "Anything else that's enough for now?" Another exhale. Then, with quiet resignation, agreed. I ended the call before he could speak again, setting the phone down with the finality of a signature. My chest rose and fell evenly. No rush of triumph, just a calm recognition that the ground had shifted. For 12 years, loyalty had kept me silent, convinced that patience would eventually be rewarded. But survival teaches a sharper lesson. Silence is wasted unless it buys you power. The next morning, I would walk back into their tower not as an afterthought, but as the architect they could no longer deny. The next morning, I crossed the lobby of Lang & Danner like a shadow stepping back into its body. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Assistants glanced up from their phones, then quickly back down, as though looking too long might summon the same fate that had already twisted the boardroom into knots. I didn't acknowledge any of them. I wasn't here for whispers. On the 23rd floor, the boardroom doors opened into a silence so thick it seemed to pull the air out of the room. Victor stood at the head of the table. His expression caught somewhere between relief and humiliation. Clive sat 2 chairs down, pale and sweating, his legal pad blank except for the desperate indentations of a pen he'd pressed too hard. I set my laptop on the polished wood and clicked it open. The projector hummed to life, casting a clean blue glow across the walls. My voice was steady, calm, the same tone I'd used for years when guiding executives through contracts they barely understood. This wasn't sabotage, I said evenly. This was negligence. You fired the only architect you had. I tapped a key, and emails filled the screen, time-stamped, forwarded, ignored. Twice in the last 5 years, I had offered to train a successor, to build a contingency plan. Twice the requests were dismissed for more urgent priorities. The subject lines told their own story. Deferred, not critical. Revisit later. I let the silence expand until it pressed on every corner of the room. No one spoke. No one could. They were all remembering the convenience of dismissing me. The luxury of assuming quiet meant powerless. Victor finally cleared his throat, but the weight of the evidence had already shifted the air. The board didn't look at me as disposable anymore. They looked at me as the system they couldn't function without. I closed the emails with a single keystroke and folded my hands on the table. "Now," I said, meeting Victor's eyes. "The question is who will answer for that negligence." The silence broke like glass. One of the directors, A man who had barely spoken in all my years of meetings leaned forward and fixed his gaze on Clive. "You knew about this." His voice was steady, but it cut sharper than any shout. Another director chimed in, louder, angrier. "You concealed a single point of failure, and you let it walk out the door. Were you hoping it wouldn't come to light until after the deals collapsed?" Clive stammered, his lips forming excuses faster than his mind could catch them. "She never documented she held everything too tightly. It wasn't my decision." Victor's hand came down on the table, flat and final. The sound carried through the room like a verdict. "Enough. You're done." The words hit harder than they had when they were thrown at me. Clive blinked, as if the floor had given way beneath him, then gathered his untouched notepad and staggered toward the door. No one followed him. No one even offered a glance of sympathy. His loafers squeaked against the polished floor until the door clicked shut, and then there was nothing but silence again. I opened my laptop, entered my credentials, and restored the contracts with a few keystrokes. The projector lit up with clean charts, signed agreements, renewal schedules all flowing back into place as if the company itself had taken a deep breath. The board watched the screen, then me, their expressions shifting from tension to awe. The same men and women who had skimmed past my name for over a decade now sat quietly, waiting for my next move. For the first time, I didn't take my usual seat on the side of the table. I walked to the head, placed my laptop in front of me, and sat down. No one objected. No one dared. The room was still humming with the aftershock of Clive's fall when I folded my hands on the table and looked around. This wasn't restoration. It was the beginning of something else. The board leaned forward as if waiting for me to declare I was ready to return to the fold, but I had no intention of sliding back into the same chair they once considered optional. I opened a new document, typed a single page, and projected it on the screen. "This," I said, "is a consultancy agreement. 5 years, renewable. You won't hire me as your employee again. You'll retain me as the sole architect of your contracts division. I'll oversee compliance, train successors, and safeguard every agreement. But it will be on my terms." Victor's jaw tightened, the same way it had when he first told me I was finished. "We expected you to come back." I met his eyes. "You wanted me erased. Now you'll have to hire me on my terms." The board murmured, some nodding, others already calculating the cost. None of them argued. They knew the alternative, running blind into the next quarter without my signature, was far worse. I scrolled to the signature block. The familiar line glowed across the bottom. Authorized Signatory Maren Calloway. With a steady hand, I signed, locking them into 5 years of dependence they could never undo. Silence filled the room. But this time, it wasn't dismissal. It was acceptance. That evening, back in my Brooklyn apartment, the air felt lighter than it had in years. Nina was sitting at the table, textbooks spread around her, a half-finished cup of cocoa cooling by her elbow. She looked up when I walked in, studying my face like she was searching for cracks. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed the top of her head. "Not scared," I said. "Free." Later, as I filed away the signed agreement in my personal archive, I let the thought settle in, sharp and certain. They tried to make me disposable, but I wrote myself into every contract, especially my own.